Hello, good afternoon, and welcome everyone, and thank you for attending this BSI webinar to launch the public consultation of our new standard framework for competence in the built environment. And can I ask the other participants to put their cameras on, please, and I'll introduce them. Thank you. So the standard was just published yesterday, so it's open for public comment now for 4 weeks. So we're going to hear all about it this afternoon. So there's been a great deal of interest in the event today, and I hope you're all connected okay and without any problems. If you are having any technical difficulties, please do let us know via the chat bar, and my colleague David will try and help out. So I'm Claire Price, I'm Sector Lead in the Built Environment BSI Standards, and I'm Programme Lead on this Built Environment Competence Standards Work Programme. And I'll be telling you more about that broader work programme a little bit later. So I'm joined today by Dr. Scott Steedman, Director of Standards at BSI, Chandru Disanayake, Director of Building Safety Reform at MHCLG, who hasn't arrived just yet, so we hope
I am here.
Ah, great, thank you, Chandru. I'm also joined by Richard Harrell, the Technical Director at CABE and Technical Author of the Standard, and by Tim Galloway, the Deputy Director of the Building Safety Programme at HSE, and he's going to be joining us for the Q&A session a little bit later on. So just a few housekeeping tips. It is a listen-only webinar. All of you are on mute for the duration. And it is being recorded as well. We're very keen to make this as engaging as possible, and we do welcome your questions via the Q&A function. So just submit them as and when you want to, and we will pick those up during the Q&A session. If there are a great many questions, so as I say, there is a lot of people who have shown an interest in the event today. We are thinking about looking if there are lots of repeated questions, certainly, and doing an FAQs on that. Right, oh, and on completion of the feedback survey, so we'll be circulating all of the presentations and the recording of the webinar in due course, and we're very keen for you to share that, please. So please do that. So can I see the agenda, please? All right, so this is our agenda for today. We'll hear a welcome and introduction from Scott. Chandru will then provide an outline of the Building Safety Bill. I'll be talking, as I said, a little bit more about the broader 2-year BECS Work Programme, and then it's the main event. And Richard will provide an outline of the new Overarching Competence Framework standard. Then we've got a fair bit of time for questions. I'll provide some further information at the end on how to get involved, and the plan is to close no later than 5 o'clock today. So if we can now switch off our cameras, that would be good. I'll switch mine off too, and I'd like to hand over to Scott.
Great.
Scott.
Thank you, Claire, and welcome everyone. The question of competence was a major theme highlighted by Dame Judith Hackett in her independent review following the Grenfell fire tragedy. She recommended and government accepted that the competence requirements for those responsible for the safety of our buildings, particularly higher risk buildings, must be agreed across industry and enforced in regulation. Raising competences in the sector is a key component to transforming the quality of work and industry culture, and it's fundamental to the mitigation of the risk of future major incidents. And to do that, as you'd expect, we need standards. I'm Scott Steedman, Director of Standards at BSI, and in our role as the national standards body, we're very pleased to be the independent facilitator of what will become the first national consensus on competence requirements for people responsible for building safety at the design, construction, refurbishment or occupation phase of the building's life. Our aim is to create as quickly as possible a new overarching competence system for the sector to support industry, residents, government and the work of the Health and Safety Executive, the HSE, as the new building safety regulator, which will be defined in the new Building Safety Bill. The Competence Standards Framework, which we're going to talk about today, and we've got a fantastic list of speakers lined up for you, is the first in a suite of new British standards that will be delivered through a programme of work running until March 2022 and supported by the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, MHCLG. The urgency to raise standards for me comes from two directions. We did work on this with the Competence Steering Group under the chairmanship of Graham Watts last year. I'm very pleased that it's now come to fruition in this new programme of work under the management of BSI. Firstly, the need for a bottom-up approach that reflects the need to strengthen the competence of individuals to do the right thing, to the right quality, at the right time, in the right way, and crucially, to realise the impact that their work has on others, particularly in relation to safety. But we also need competent leadership, what I've called a top-down approach. The avoidance of catastrophic failures or major incidents, by that I mean low probability, high consequence events, requires a culture that's set in the boardroom, reflecting where accountability for safety ultimately lies. The new regulated roles defined in the Building Safety Bill will require softer skills during design, construction and occupation phases that go beyond the recognised technical health and safety skills and are not common in the sector today. The need for senior people occupying positions of high responsibility to be able to demonstrate these competences is well understood in other industries, for example in petrochemicals or gas. And the new standards for the built environment will learn from that experience. These two approaches, the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach, obviously need to complement each other. They need to use a common language and have scope for independent third-party accreditation. Hence, we need a suite of standards that will provide a framework for all the many organisations that are responsible for training and professional development in the built environment and to support the new regulator in regulating these important and onerous roles at the top of the profession. The new framework is aimed at everyone involved in service delivery for buildings falling under the new building safety regulatory regime. That includes owners, investors, insurers, architects, designers, engineers, building contractors, building safety managers, installers, fire service professionals, those working in building control, product supply, and certification services, and most importantly, the general public, whose lives depend on the work of others. So moving on to the business today, I'm very pleased to see that we have so many people, 730 people in fact, registered for this milestone event this afternoon, and I'm very grateful to our speakers for their time, all of which demonstrates the high level of interest in this very important subject. As this is the launch of our public consultation stage of the new standard, I really encourage you to download the document that Claire's been talking about, we'll talk about in a few minutes, and submit your comments so that the committee can consider them properly. So thank you very much. Welcome again. Let me now hand over to Chandru Dissanayake, Director of Building Safety Reform at MHCLG. Thank you, and over to you, Chandru.
Thank you, Scott. I'm sorry I don't have a camera today. I'm afraid I've had to dial in. Technology doesn't allow it from the department, so I do apologise. But needless to say, I am better looking on the phone than I am in person. Let me kick off and just start by saying thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all of those who've chosen to join us. I am, as Scott said, the Director of Building Safety Reform in the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, and part of my role is ensuring that we bring the Building Safety Bill to Parliament, set up 2 new national regulators, and drive a culture change across the sector. And to begin with, I wanted to just share an extract from a poem. And those of you who've heard me before know I often like to do that. But I think this powerfully expresses why the bill we introduced in July and this competency work that we are talking about today is so needed, and why change is long overdue in this sector. Now, this poem was written by the acclaimed author and poet Ben Okri and was published just days after the Grenfell Tower tragedy in June 2017. And it's a moment I personally relive every day when I go to work on what I think is one of the most important agendas that we are doing in government. And so I begin. Residents of the area call it the crematorium. It was revealed the undercurrents of our age, the poor who thought voting for the rich would save them, the poor who believed all the papers said, the poor who listened with their fears, the poor who live in their rooms and dream for their kids. The poor are you and I, you in your garden of flowers, in your house of books who gaze from afar, at the destiny that draws near with another name. Sometimes it takes an image to wake up a nation from its secret shame. And here it is, every name of someone burnt to death on the stairs or in the room, who had no idea what they died for or how they were betrayed. They did not die when they died. Their deaths happened long before. It happened in the minds of people who never saw them. It happened in the profit margins. It happened in the laws. They died because money could be saved and made. So in the department, we're clear that we are changing the law, but on its own, it's not going to deliver the change that we need. Dame Judith Hackett, in her independent review, was also clear that the industry needs to change its behaviours and practices. And this goes beyond law and addresses the fundamental culture that drives behaviours and the competencies that sit around that. And behaviours that ignore resident safety concerns, that seek to maximise profits by cutting corners on safety, that thinks ignorance of safety performance is acceptable, and that ignores safety maintenance, that does not take responsibility, must change. We must all take responsibility and drive that change. And by embedding safety into our normal practices, I think we can. It's critical. It will become the bridge between law and culture. If I could go to my first slide, actually, timeline. On the 20th of July, we published the draft Building Safety Bill for pre-legislative scrutiny. We recognise that this bill represents the biggest change to the way we build and manage buildings in decades, and we do really want to ensure we get this right. So our hope is that by publishing it for scrutiny, we can improve it, make it better before we take it into Parliament for introduction. And we also hope that it will provide enough sight so industry can begin that change now as well. But we have no doubt, once pre-legislative scrutiny concludes and we make the improvements, this will be introduced to become law. Next slide, please. The bill is published in 5 parts. Part 1 provides a very brief overview, so I'm not even going to touch on that. And it's really part 2 where we begin to get into the meat of the new regime. It establishes the Health and Safety Executive as the building safety regulator with 3 broad functions. The first is to implement the new regime for higher risk buildings. This includes acting as their building control authority and overseeing and enforcing the regime in occupation. Second, it will oversee the regulatory regime for safety and performance of all buildings. This will include overseeing the performance of other building control bodies like local authorities and improved inspectors, as well as advising on building standards and safety risks. Third, it will assist and encourage the improving of competence across industry, including building inspectors and professionals. This includes housing and setting the direction of an industry-led competence committee, building on the work currently being undertaken by the competence steering group, and establishing a unified building control profession with competence requirements. Part 2 also seeks to set out the definition of what a building safety risk or sets out a building safety risk and a higher risk building. It creates the powers to amend these definitions based on advice from the building safety regulator, HSE. For day 1, we intend the regulations to define higher risk buildings as covering all multi-occupied residential buildings above 18 metres or more in height, or more than 6 stories, whichever is reached first. Next slide, please. Part 3. Now, this part amends the Building Act. It allows the building safety regulator to act as the building control authority for the high-risk buildings that I mentioned before, and it also provides powers for building regulations to be set out the detail of the new regime. For instance, it will introduce the gateway processes, Gateway 1, Gateway 2, and Gateway 3, and also construction and refurbishment of buildings that are in scope. It establishes the regime for duty holders, which will be familiar to those operating within construction, design and management regulations. And finally, it puts in place requirements for registration of building inspectors and provides powers for the regulator to take action where building control function is operating below the standards expected. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to turn to part 4. This is all about the management of building and occupation. In this part, we define the accountable person and building safety manager. We put in place requirements for registering a building, applying for a building assurance certificate, the ongoing management of safety, and safety information to be held as part of what Dame Judith Hackett called the golden thread. But most importantly, we set out a requirement for ongoing engagement with residents. There's also a provision on the obligations residents will have in relation to safety in their buildings, and finally measures around cost recoveries, including measures where an accountable person is not fulfilling their duties. Next slide, please. Finally, on part 5. Now, this part deals with bits that are complementary to the new regime, such as provisions to ensure that the new Homes Ombudsman scheme is available, and a power to make regulations that require developers to join the scheme, powers in relation to construction products, and reform on disciplinary orders made by the Architects Registration Board. Finally, it introduces a provision making it easier for social housing complainants to escalate a complaint to the Housing Ombudsman Service directly. Now, that's a broad outline of the bill, but before I finish, I wanted to focus a bit more on competency. So if you could move to the next slide, please. Clause 10 in the draft bill requires the new building safety regulator to establish a committee on industry competence. It places a duty on the duty holders to ensure everyone working on higher risk buildings are competent for their roles. That is why this work that we are talking about today is so important. The reforms that we are introducing in law won't achieve the results we want. We need to raise the skills, competence and transparency of that across the industry, backed by a robust national competence framework. That's why we're pleased to sponsor this programme, working with industry and BSI to make this happen. These standards are the key to underpinning the reforms that we all want to see, and to ensure that everyone working on buildings is sufficiently competent. The expertise that industry brings to this work is vital, and we really do welcome industry's leadership on it, and we look forward to getting the Competence Steering Group's final report due to be published shortly. We all recognise there's more to do, and we urge you and industry and everyone to continue to refine sector-specific frameworks, identify skills and capacity gaps, provide relevant training, develop continuous development programmes, and set up accredited schemes. Residents are looking for us to take this forward. They need it, they deserve it, and we must rebuild trust and confidence. Next slide, please. Now, you can find out more in the links highlighted on this slide, but let me leave you with my final thought from my talk at least. Change to law is coming, but we don't have to wait for that law. Changing our practices now to ensure buildings and residents are safe is things that we can do. So I encourage you to get involved, and thank you for listening to me. Scott, I hand back to you, I think.
Thank you very much, Chandru. That was really, really helpful. I mean, just super to hear it from you like that. Thank you. I'm going to hand over, I think, to Claire Price in my team, who's going to now carry us through the work programme. Claire, over to you.
Thank you very much, Scott, and thank you, Chandru. Yes, so I'll be providing a broad view of what is a 2-year work programme being delivered by BSI. And it'll give, so it'll provide some context for the new framework standard and just give that bigger picture of what we're planning to do and how we're planning to roll out standards in this area over the next 2 years. So next slide, please. So as has already been said, this work has arisen out of the overall review of building safety that was led by Dame Judith Hackett following that dreadful fire at Grenfell Tower. The review itself challenged the built environment industry to improve competence across the sector. The competence steering group was set up, led by Graham Watts, and Raising the Bar was published in August 2019. That document contained 67 recommendations and included a recommendation to create a suite of national standards and supporting documents under the national standards body that would underpin increased scrutiny through accredited third-party approval. So BSI set to work. I was brought in and began to work on this last autumn to develop a programme of work that could deliver what was required. Next slide, please. So it is a significant task, developing a suite of standards in the short term. We will be running the programme over 2 years, but of course work will continue long after that. I mean, effectively, we are creating a new standards work stream that'll be maintained, reviewed, improved, owned by BSI and industry for as long as it's needed. The outputs are also a potentially very big change for industry. So this programme is adopting a consultative approach. It's really important that we engage, that we're consulting throughout. You know, we want that engagement, we want that buy-in. It's absolutely vital for this to really work and for this change to be taken up. So phase 1, it began back in the spring. Actually, before the project itself started, we held a town hall event in March to outline the plan of work to run it past industry, and it was a well-attended event back in March to hear views on what we were proposing and how it would be delivered. It was well received, and the programme itself started in earnest in April. So we established a strategy group of technical experts to advise and manage the key elements of the programme as a whole. There's 38 members on the BECS strategy group. We've developed a website which has had good visits so far, 1,200 web page visits so far, and we developed a glossy BECS brochure as well, which has been downloaded by quite a few people and is still available on the website to download if you want to do that. Most importantly, a document that had been developed initially in the competence steering group was handed to BSI as a base document to be developed as a British standard under a BSI advisory panel. And that's the main piece of work for phase 1, and obviously what we're here to talk about today. The message from industry and from the consumer groups was that speed is important. So we are developing the standard using the new BSI Flex process, and that's how we've been able to issue the document for consultation after what is really a very short period of time, 4 months really, to get the advisory group in place, to take the document, to give it that first review and to prepare it and publish it for public consultation. A research project is taking place between now and Christmas. That's going to be scoping out the further 3 documents that we're expecting to deliver during phase 2. And during phase 2, a new BSI technical committee will be established to finalise publication of the framework and to effectively own it, and any other formal standards work that is developed over the next few years. The rest of the suite will be developed and published, those 3 PAS documents for the 3 new regulated roles. And we'll be working with other agencies as well, such as the new regulator, accreditation bodies, assessment organisations, and so on, to prepare for implementation and rollout in 2022 and beyond. Next slide, please. So this is what is being delivered over the 2-year programme in the pink box. The Built Environment Competence Standards Suite, so-called BECS Suite, as we call it. The overarching framework is there at the top, and which is going to be talking about that today. We're expecting to publish some supporting guidance next year, and the 3 new standards frameworks for the newly regulated roles of principal designer, principal contractor, and building safety manager. And they're going to be delivered as PAS documents starting next year. Building safety manager framework probably beginning in January. The other 2 documents we expect to start in the spring next year. So I have included the blue box there because, as I've said already, the Competence Steering Group, WG0, recommended this suite of standards. There are 12 other working groups working on the development of framework documents for their own sectors and subsectors. For example, WG5 for fire safety officers. Now, these are really outside of the this BSI work programme currently. The documents that are being developed by those groups are expected to map against the new overarching framework, and it is possible that at some future date some of these frameworks may be brought in to BSI, converted to British Standard documents if that's deemed to be necessary or indeed desirable. And they'll be delivered under the new technical committee we're setting up next year, the BECS 1 technical committee. Next slide, please. Right, so this is the timetable for the development of the new BS Flex 8670 overarching framework document. So speed is one aspect that I've already mentioned, and consultation is the other aspect I've mentioned. And because of this need for engagement and consultation, we will be having 3 periods of public consultation for the delivery of this document. That's part of the Flex process. It's an iterative process. It moves quickly and allows for extensive consultation by industry and commenting by industry. So in this instance, we'll have the 3 consultation periods. The current version is available now. It was published yesterday and is available for comment until the 21st of October. The comments will be reviewed by the advisory group, and a second version is expected in December. We'll probably have a slightly longer consultation period for iteration 2 because it is Christmas, although I've heard it's cancelled this year, but it is Christmas, so there'll probably be more of a 6-week period to comment before late January on consultation 2. Again, further comments and further changes will lead to version 3. And the final consultation will be a full 2-month consultation period issued under the new technical committee. So it will be a full British Standard draft for public consultation and run for 2 months. If all goes well, and of course that is entirely down to the levels of comments that we receive and the way the document is developed, we really hope to be publishing well before the end of 2021. I think really with 3 consultation periods, we should really achieve consensus so that that final consultation as the full British standard goes fairly smoothly and that we are able to publish within a few months after that. But the end of the work programme is actually spring 2022, so we have that period of time within which we can finalise it if that's necessary. And we would expect as well that to have a shorter review period. This is going to be a brand new document. It's an important document. It may well need a shorter review period than the full 5-year review period that we usually have for British standards. So we have the link there to the standards development portal, standardsdevelopment.bsigroup.com, where you can go and submit your comments. But the document itself will remain freely accessible on the wider competence programme site throughout the programme. So each of the consultation 1, 2 and 3 will be available there throughout to review and to use. And of course, as you know, if you want to download it prior to submitting comments, then you can go there to do that. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to finish by providing a list of the advisory group representative organisations. You know, a standards development group should be no more than 15 to 20 members. And in this case, because this is this overarching framework that is applicable right across the board, right across the industry, you know, we've tried to include individuals who are part of organisations with a very large and broad reach. So, for example, we have the CPA, which is an association of associations, to have that reach. And we also have the BECS, our strategy group, is also represented on that group, and they report back to those 40 members that sit on BECS, that are both industry representation and consumer and resident groups on BECS. So again, sort of reaching out to as broad a level of participation as possible. We also have a review panel, and their role is very much to comment and be involved in the development of the draft as well. They're informed of every iteration as it comes out. For this project, it is potentially over 900 already on that review panel. I think all of the people who've signed up to this event today have been invited to join that. And if you agree, you'll be notified at each consultation launch so that you can review and so that you can comment. And through that contact, we will also invite you to participate in other aspects of the programme, such as the 3 PAS development projects that will be taking place next year, and possibly also in the research programme. We are expecting to run a workshop too in the new year. And of course, if you are interested in being further involved, please use the dedicated email address that's up on the screen now. I think all of this information is available in a handout. If you are able to click on that handouts field, you'll be able to see all of the relevant email addresses and the website details on there. So that's it from me. I will now hand over to Richard, Technical Director of TAVE and the Technical Author of the Overarching Framework Standard, which he's going to tell you about now. So Thank you again for listening, and Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you everyone who has come to learn more about the standard for coming today. I'm, as Claire said, I'm Technical Director at CABE, and my involvement with the competence standards has included contributing to Working Group 0, which looked at setting the overarching framework, but also a wide range of other groups, including Working Group 1 engineers, Working Group 6, which was building control designers, and Working Group 7, but also a number of other groups. So I've had contact with a very wide range of people with a very wide range of different approaches to competence in the industry, and we're using that learning and knowledge in the work that we're doing to develop this standard. So what I'm hoping to do today is to explain some of the key principles of this overarching framework for competence, try to explain a bit of more about what it is and what it isn't, go through the key features and structure, and explain where we want your assistance in helping to develop the framework further. So if I could have the next slide, please. So where has this come from? Well, this is a continuation of the work that, as been described already, that's been undertaken primarily under the auspices of the competence steering group set up by the industry response groups. It's now part of a very rapid iterative process, but with extensive consultation, and today being a very important moment in getting a much wider set of views and input into the drafting development. We are absolutely clear in our own minds that we expect this draft to be improved. It is not fixed, so your comments and feedback are really important. But it does carry forward the recommendations made in the Raising the Bar report, which will be followed shortly by the final report of the Competence Steering Group, which I understand is due to be published shortly. We're trying to achieve something that's pragmatic and practical in the built environment to support competence. We do remain entirely open-minded about what is needed to ensure we can support the necessary step change in competence management, in culture, and as an output in building safety. So we're very much interested in wider views. But what we do need to be clear about is that the framework relates specifically to individual competence rather than organisational competence, although it does set some context in relation to organisational competence. Next slide, please. So we want to use this framework to set a common approach to competence frameworks for persons working in the built environment. So objective one is to reduce fragmentation, to build commonality of understanding and commonality of approach, which will help people as they move between different parts of the built environment sector, but also in sharing knowledge and capability. We want to establish common core competence requirements for persons working on higher risk buildings. And of course, this is absolutely critical. This is the starting point of all of this work. But we need to establish those competences which are needed to ensure that people are safe when they occupy buildings and throughout the life cycle. We're looking to establish measurable structural requirements for sector-specific competence frameworks. It's very important to think about this specification through the lens of those people who will sit on the Building Safety Regulators Industry Competence Committee. This framework sets a structure that allows like-for-like comparison and consistent comparison as to whether the frameworks that come forward to be looked at, the sector-specific frameworks, are actually achieving what is needed to keep people safe. It also introduces common competence requirements for behaviour and ethics to better reflect government's approach to defining competence, which I'll speak about shortly, and support industry-wide culture change. So this is an engine to help drive the changes that are needed, that have been so well set out by others previously in this session. We want to use this framework to help develop a common language for use in sector-specific frameworks, and that there are two ways we do that. One through the key terms and definitions for competence in the specification, but also by including a common glossary of terms relevant to building safety in higher risk buildings. And that commonality of language is in itself a powerful way of improving safety and outcomes. And we also want to ensure that we can establish a common baseline understanding of the fundamentals of building safety risk, including fire safety, structural safety, but also other public health risks. And that's being delivered through informative annexes. Next slide, please. So when you review the standard, when you start to read it, there are certain key issues that I think it'd be really useful for you to bear in mind. So the first is this: the specification is a framework for sector-specific competence frameworks rather than the competence framework itself. So although it includes competences, it's about setting a structure and a set of challenges for other more detailed frameworks, reflecting the wide variety of competence required across a whole range of the built environment's roles and functions, rather than it being a specific framework. The second point is that it's not intended to replace or supersede existing qualification or competence frameworks. It's anticipated that those frameworks will over time flex and modify to reflect any areas where they don't already include the relevant common competencies set in this framework. But it's not intended to replace the baseline frameworks that you're familiar with and use today. It's intended to act as a benchmark to drive common good practice and to support the development of new frameworks. So it's useful in reviewing existing frameworks, but it's also intended to be a good starting point for those who are developing frameworks for the first time. And it also aims to challenge existing frameworks to think more holistically about shared competence and interfaces with other actors. What is very clear from all of the learning we've done since the tragic events at Grenfell Tower is that it's not simply about individual competence, it's about collective competence and about collective and holistic outcomes. And we're aiming to help bridge those gaps through the framework itself. Claire has outlined before that this is part of a suite of documents. And it's critical to understand that the specification will be referred to by others. So we anticipate that the building safety regulator will refer to this framework, and other organisations may well do the same. So the framework doesn't set out the way or determine the way that it will be applied, but it provides a framework that others can mandate or use. Next slide, please. In looking at this, it's important to understand some of the following assumptions. How the specification is used will be set out in proposed handshake guidance, regulation and statutory guidance. So that will come later. That will come later. The way that the standard will be applied will be explained and developed further over time. It's anticipated that the Industry Competence Committee within the Building Safety Regulator will adopt a mapping approach to the use of this specification. We see this as absolutely critical to ensure that this overarching approach is relevant and usable across the incredibly large span of roles and functions that it needs to apply to. That is underpinned by a comply or explain approach, which will effectively ask that the framework's compliance is either demonstrated, evidenced, or where there's a reason for it to be accepted, that is also explained and justified. Again, this is about a pragmatic and deliverable approach that drives consistency across a very wide range of roles and sectors. Next slide, please. So how have we gone about that? Well, I'm just going to talk about the structure and content of the standard briefly. The structure is very familiar to those who are already familiar with British standards. The first section, the introduction, is actually one of the largest sections. However, what we have developed is a text which we hope will act as an informative primer, setting out key context and concepts, and which can build that common appreciation and understanding across industry in relation to competence. So it explains what competence is and why it matters. It looks at the core competence components of effective sector-specific competence frameworks, but it also looks at behavior change, safety culture, and ethics, which are, of course, absolutely critical to achieving the outcomes that are desired. We hope that that section will be useful to those who are more experienced with competence frameworks, but will also support those who are coming to learn about competence for the first time to really accelerate that learning and give them the confidence to move forward. Section 1 sets out the scope of the document in more detail. Section 2, normative references, and Section 3, key terms and definitions. These are obviously absolutely key as we move forward in building cohesive mechanisms and frameworks across industry. Next slide, please. Section 4 is the first of the sections that sets out detailed compliance requirements. And this section covers the structure and content of all sector-specific frameworks. So it's intended to be a framework that can apply whether a sector-specific framework is relevant to higher-risk buildings or not. These are criteria, components, elements that are seen as vital in developing and utilising effective frameworks. Section 5 sets out the core behavioural and ethical competences for all built environment frameworks similarly. So in Section 4 and 5, we're trying to set a baseline that applies to all frameworks going forward and can be used as a vehicle to drive culture change in the industry as a whole, not just on higher risk buildings. Section 6 sets out the requirements for shared competence when working on higher risk buildings. We anticipate that it's possible for frameworks to adopt Section 4 and 5 without having to adopt Section 6, but of course it's possible that compliance with all three parts will be required. These earlier sections are supported by informative annexes, but Section 6 in particular has annexes setting out a baseline understanding of fire and life safety, structural safety, public health and public safety, and a glossary of terms, if you like, common terms relating to safety in higher risk buildings. Again, this is all about ensuring we have a shared common understanding of the fundamentals that we need to address. One last item I'd like to note before talking about these sections in more detail. The specification is over 54 pages long at the moment, but the sections with which compliance will be required run to only about 10 pages. So in practice, the mapping exercise, we hope, and I'll talk more about mapping later, the mapping exercise will not prove overly bureaucratic, but it does of course need to meet our objectives. Next slide, please. Before I move on to looking at those sections, I wanted to touch on one of the very, very key principles that underpins where this framework sits in the hierarchy of assuring competence. The approach to competence we've taken reflects the proposals in the Building Safety Bill for the definition of competence. That's based around skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. Behaviours are an area which hasn't always been specified in frameworks for this sector, but government has been very explicit in setting out the need to include behavioural competence, and the structure of the standard now reflects that. Within the standard as a whole, it's very important to understand the difference between competence and competences, and competency and competencies. These are terminologies with very specific meanings adopted from practice in wider industry. This framework for competence sets out requirements that are at the first level. So they are at a competence level, which focuses on functions rather than task level descriptors or skills, which are reflected in the definition of competencies. We, in principle, think that whilst this framework focuses on competence, it will be for the sector-specific frameworks to set out the more specific competency and competencies required of people to demonstrate that they are able to work in that sector. Next slide, please. So, section 4. I just want to talk a bit more on what is required in this section. This is a set of requirements for the structure and information provided within a sector-specific framework. So these are the types of information and the clarity that we believe is required for a sector-specific framework to ensure it's delivering consistent assessment to the right standards. It needs an overview explaining to the people using it, its purpose, where it sits within their sector. It needs to define the relevant sectors in scope, the roles in scope, types of building operations and building work in scope, relevant regulatory or legislative regimes to which it relates, the specific roles against which the framework will enable assessment. Needs to define prior learning, so any pre-qualification or pre-established requirements for competence. Needs to talk about competence levels and standards, so it needs to explain how to differentiate between people who are working at different levels of sophistication within the sector. It needs to set out requirements for validation, so requirements for the first time that someone is assessed, requirements for revalidation, so how often and how people will be revalidated against the framework, and how to check competence of individuals validated against the framework. Now, I'm just going to reiterate that we see this being used in large part in a comply or explain methodology, so that if any of these requirements are not relevant, it's possible, we think, it's reasonable to explain why that's the case, but that will be tested by the Industry Competence Committee, and of course those arrangements are still to be fully formalised. But these are the fundamental structural components, and this list has been developed through analysis of all of the competence frameworks developed under the CSG and with input from wider industry. They're not overly demanding, but they really are critical in making sector-specific frameworks work and in enabling consistent assessment of whether they are adequate. Next slide, please. Section 5 looks at behavioural competence, and there are 5 key components here: acting ethically and contributing to safe outcomes, leadership, teamwork and communication, individual and organisational competence, personal responsibility and accountability, and duty of care to others, including building occupants. These are common criteria, and they're needed to underpin the development of competence supporting a strong safety culture. They're also needed to support wider culture change in the built environment, and they're also incorporate a number of shared competencies that will help improve productivity. So there are real business wins through adopting these approaches. But what's critical is that these characteristics will enable industry to move forward. These are areas that we think have been neglected. Certainly the evidence suggests that these are not behaviours that are evidenced to the right level at the moment within the industry, and certainly not consistently. And so this is the start of what we see as a very important change in behavioural dynamics within the sector as a whole. Next slide, please. And then section 6 sets out core competence requirements for safety and higher risk buildings. This is obviously absolutely critical in enabling the Industry Committee on Competence to assess whether sector-specific frameworks which oversee the competence of those who will work on high-risk buildings are adequate. And again, there are 5 areas specific to higher-risk buildings where competences are set out. Ethics, there are some specific ethical considerations that need to be taken into account. Managing safety, knowledge management and communication, buildings as systems and construction products, and of course, critically, fire and life safety. These core competencies are the areas where shared competence is required to deliver the safe outcomes that we want to see. And these have been largely drawn from analysis of all of the competence frameworks which have been developed for higher risk buildings within the work of the CSG, and then with further analysis and input. Those people who've seen earlier drafts of this framework, perhaps at the Town Hall event in February, will see that the scope of these proposed competencies has been reviewed, and it's been brought into a much more succinct set of headings and to a degree condensed. But there is a great deal of scope within these specific competencies. And we really do want to get input as to whether people think we have got the right coverage, whether there are competencies that are missing, and particularly as to clarity of the text and the drive of the objectives of each of the competencies within that framework. Next slide, please. The last thing I wanted to say about the kind of key principles was really that the mapping approach that we see being adopted, and which enables people to maintain their existing frameworks but developing them where there are weaknesses, so in effect the mapping approach is a gap analysis process, is really critical. And we think that the sector-specific frameworks, those developing them or maintaining them, need to think about the use of this specification in the following way. They need to think very carefully about how the competencies set out in this framework are relevant to their roles, functions, tasks and activities in that sector. It's absolutely critical that the sector-specific framework developers contextualize appropriately the way that these competencies are used. Need to develop more appropriate, more detailed activity and task level competencies within those frameworks to respond to the higher level function competencies in this framework, and need to establish appropriate levels against those competencies. So again, taking into account the variability in complexity of tasks that people will need to execute. The aim is that the Industry Competence Committee will be able to compare the frameworks on a more consistent basis where this mapping approach is taken, and also to ensure that sectors are challenged to think more holistically about the competencies that are required to deliver building safety and behavioural change, and to fill those gaps where these are identified. So this is again absolutely critical. It's a challenge process as much as a compliance process. Next slide, please. A word about the informative annexes. As I said earlier, these are intended to act as primer, perhaps for people less familiar with building safety risks, and to provide a common baseline of safety risks for all actors in manufacturing, design, specification, installation, maintenance and management. But they're also there to help challenge siloed thinking. So if you believe you understand the fire risks or structural risks associated with your role and sector, looking at these informative annexes, we hope will help you to identify interfaces where you need to perhaps improve the competence of the people who are assessed under the frameworks you own. We're very keen to get feedback on these annexes, whether there are any errors, whether the key risks are properly covered, and if the drafting is at the right level. Next slide, please. And there are some areas where we believe the draft already needs further development. This is obviously the first iteration of the standard. There'll be at least 3 other phases of consultation before it becomes a British standard. We want your input on how to clarify the text. We want your input on structure and content of the sector-specific framework competences to ensure they're practical and useful. We're really interested in views on whether we have pitched the behavioural core competences at the right level and whether they will actually have the effect we want. We're very keen to strengthen the text on residents' voice and the need for consultation with building occupants, and that's an area where we are already actively working to develop the text further. And we want your views on reviewing and developing common terminology. How do we develop a common language for safety and for competence in the industry? We're very open-minded in terms of the feedback we get, and we will absolutely value and listen to your views and thoughts. That brings me to the end of my presentation. I think if you go to the next slide, please. And I think we will be moving on to the Q&A session, so I'll hand back to Claire.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. That was a really useful, comprehensive overview of the document and the standard. And I have had a few questions coming through about access to the consultation version and where to submit comments. If you go to the handouts field in the corner of your screen on the Go to Webinar, there is a handout one which has the web details on there where you can go and submit comments. All right, so we're going to move to the Q&A session now. And you've heard from us, so quite a few questions have come through. I would like to invite Tim to say a few words, really, and to thank him for joining us for the Q&A session on behalf of HSE. And you know, I would like you to sort of give us an idea of how you feel this programme will connect with HSE's role as the new building safety regulator.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks for the opportunity to join this Q&A session. I want to reflect, I think, a couple of comments from previous speakers. I was struck by Chandru's discussion on the need for cultural change, and also I think it was Richard's conversation around leadership in the area. And what strikes me about the work that we will want to do as the regulator-elect when we become the building safety regulator, it will be to be part of what I call the building safety system, could be better called the built environment system, because the regulator is only part of the equation here. And the industry, acknowledging that in that word is encompassed a number of different sectors, from the providers of social housing through design and build, construction companies and other providers, installers, maintenance companies, etc., the accountable persons. It is going to be the whole system that drives forward that cultural change that leads to the improvement that we're all seeking. The regulator will be part of that equation. We'll be part of that equation in seeking to facilitate that cultural change and demonstrate leadership and support those who are leaders in the sector, in the industry, whatever it happens to be, but also ultimately to be the organisation that steps in when things potentially go wrong, or when people are not doing what the great majority of the sectors, the organisations will want to do. And that's actually to meet the challenge head on and to establish those new standards and meet the requirements of the law. And it's very important, I think, that there is that backstop of a regulator who is able to take action where that is warranted. That said, I'm not sitting here believing or seeking to establish an organisation, a regulator, who is simply waiting to trip people up. That's not the way that HSE has operated in our mainstream work of occupational health and safety, and we've been involved in that work for over 40 years now. We count very much our approach as one of being proportionate, both in the standards that we work with industries to set, but also our approach to individual decisions where we come across issues. And thus I would want us to continue to be a proportionate regulator and to operate in this space very much in that way. And that will be how we will want to approach competence as well. And those organisations that are working within the framework that Richard has laid out, that are working within the framework that individual sectors may set, are going to be the kind of organisations that we will want to see flourish. What we won't want to see flourish are those who seek to undermine or seek to avoid or seek not to work to the same standards as everyone else.
Thank you. All right. So there's been quite a few questions about relationships with other regulations and how the safety bill connects with the building regulations. I think, Chandra, we had one question about the inviting you to say more about the impact on the building regulations and whether they're entirely under review. But we've also had a number of questions about the CDM regulations and how the competence aspects of the process that are going to be developed, particularly for the principal designer and contractor, relate to those CDM regulations. So perhaps, Chandra, I could ask you first to address the question on the regulations.
Yes, so building regulations remain as is. It's a functional set of regulations which refers to statutory advice. What this bill does is it looks to amend it in places and strengthen it in places. And what I mean by that is it amends it in places in that it uses the powers in building regulations to establish new gateway points, stop-go-start points, essentially, and also introduces powers to establish the regulator and give that new regulator powers to operate, where previously that was devolved to local authorities to their building control functions. So it establishes those things using building regulations and amending building regulations. It also strengthens building regulations, interestingly, in some places. So, for instance, where approved inspectors and building control were treated differently and had different performance requirements, what this regulation seeks to do is to really introduce registration for building control, regardless of whether they're in the public or private sector, and competency requirements to be described in secondary and in guidance, and performance structures overseeing both. So it strengthens the intent that was there. Another place it strengthens intent is where it traditionally has been held that building regulations only apply for a year after construction finishes, or at the most 2 years in certain elements. This seeks to extend that to 10 years. So contractors are liable for 10 years afterwards. So what it does is amends elements of it, strengthens entire other parts of it, but what it absolutely does not do is get rid of building regulations. Building regulations remain, it is powerful, but its delivery and its operational elements of it are strengthened and amended, particularly in relation to higher risk buildings and the building regulator. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. And on the CDM, who would like to pick that up? Would that be you, Richard?
Well, I can provide some thought. We're looking to kind of try and clarify how the CDM regulations and these competence standards interrelate. Clearly, the intention is that within the bill there are requirements for those who have existing duties under CDM to also undertake some of the key duties in relation to compliance with the building regulations, the principal designer and principal contractor being the two primary of those, but also designers and contractors, I think. This framework, the specification, will be able to span all of those, and it will have some commonality with the competences needed for construction and design and management competence, there is a discussion to be had and some work to be done to determine the full scope of the proposed principal designer and principal contractor competence frameworks that will be developed in the second phase, and the extent to which they also incorporate CDM competences. So it would be, I think the intent is very clearly to ensure that these frameworks mesh to the best effect. But we'd be interested, I'm sure, in people's thoughts about how we need to make that work. I don't know if Tim would also want to comment on that.
Thank you, Richard.
Sorry, Tim.
No, go ahead, Scott, please.
Well, while you're gathering your thoughts, my view of that, Richard, you've expressed it very well, but my view of this relationship is that the competences that we are talking about, that we would expect from principal designers and principal contractors in their regulated roles in the future, as will be determined by HSE as the building safety regulator. But my view of it is that it's about the additional competences that we expect of these two roles in particular, over and above their CDM obligations, to consider the issues associated with major incidents in the long term, where the risks are greatest during occupation phase. So it's all about the golden thread and how that is, the design intent will be maintained through the life, through refurbishment, and therefore the skill set we're describing or attempting to describe for the regulated roles, that we will describe for the regulated roles, goes above and beyond, I think, the skill set and the competencies that we think of today for the CDM roles. But Tim, correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, I look at it as the need for things to align, for there to be a complementary set of skills. Clearly, where you've got people who are going to work on a high risk building, which Chandru gave you the initial day one definition of that, then there's going to be an expectation that they are competent to do the work that they're being asked to do, that what they are going to do will not compromise or increase the possibility of a catastrophic incident. But I don't think anybody on the panel, I don't think anybody listening would want a completely different system, would want people to almost be carrying an entire wallet full of various competency cards that if they ever want to do anything. Rather, we're looking to, as I think it was Richard said, mesh the systems, and let's understand that there is commonality in certainly in some areas, that I would want the person who comes to work on the HRB to understand both how to keep themselves safe, keep the resident of the apartment they're working in safe while they're doing that work, but also to do that work in a way that means that what they leave behind is safe. And I see those things being part and parcel of the overall competence of that individual to have end-to-end safety. And let's reflect on Dame Judith's report, which very much does seek to focus on end-to-end safety.
That was a very nice way of expressing it, Tim. I thought the meshing and the complementary is exactly right.
Thank you. Did anyone else have anything to say on that subject? I think it's certainly some consideration through the research phase that we're going through at the moment for those three standards for the newly regulated roles. It has come up a few times. So we have had a lot of questions as well around scope and extending the scope and the definition of the high buildings, the potential impact, particularly on low-rise residential buildings, and also a question on, well, the ground engineering side, really, the site investigation. Does this extend to that pre-build, pre-design work as well? Where shall I start on that one? Any takers? Firstly, on the higher risk, extending that scope of higher risk, perhaps you, Richard.
I'm tempted to pass this to Chandra in a moment, but I mean, clearly there is the government has taken a kind of proportionate approach, a risk-based approach. The key challenge that was set for the competence steering group was around enabling the differentiation by those appointing people to undertake works between those who were competent to work on higher risk buildings and those who weren't. And that's clearly what this specification is intended to underpin. It's intended to enable people to have confidence that where people have got different skill sets, they've got the right skill sets to deliver safety through the life cycle of the building. I have no doubt that over time the scope of the higher risk regime will modify based on risk, based on other factors. And of course this specification will be reviewed periodically to reflect that. In terms of the extension of scope, you know, again, with the core competencies for behaviour and trying to set a broader framework for competence for all people working in the built environment, regardless of whether they're working on high risk buildings or not, we are seeking through this specification to drive positive change across the full range of building work. These are foundation blocks. They are the base building blocks of an industry that measures, assesses and revalidates competence as a norm, where that just hasn't happened in the past. So I think we certainly perceive that this has very broad beneficial application. The behavioural competence that we're trying to drive across the industry as a whole is all about a safety culture and a better culture. It would then be, of course, up to government and others to look at the more detailed scope and modify that over time.
Yeah, do you want me to add a bit to that?
Yes, please.
So government has been clear that on day one, the scope will be for buildings above 18 metres and or with 6 stories or more, and that's whichever comes first. And the reason we've been clear about that is because based on Dame Judith's advice, we recognise that height, while not the only measure, is an influencer in relation to risk of the people in the building. And so what we're saying is day one, that will definitely be the scope. But the way we've structured the bill is that the bill doesn't actually define the scope. That gets defined in secondary legislation. And the secondary legislation will follow once the bill is introduced. Now, we've set out the intention of that, but what we've also said is we know that there are other criteria that influence risk, and we did a call for evidence, and we've got the results of that, and the team are working through that. But what we want to ensure is that any changes to scope or any way in which we look at risk in buildings is done on an evidence basis. And so the regulator will have the powers to provide advice to the Secretary of State to change the scope in relation to risk factors so that it can be amended and be relevant and be kept up to date based on evidence. So while the government hasn't set out an intention to increase it to 11 metres or to care homes or anything like that, what we have said very clearly is this is what's definitely in, and based on the evidence that the regulator is able to provide, it may change in the future, but it will be changed based on evidence around risk. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And I mean, I think that this ties loosely really to a question that came in about standards and obviously these standards being very important within the context of the bill, but you know, the nature of their life beyond the scope of the building safety bill, and I think that's one for you really, Scott.
Sorry, Claire.
Did you hear that?
No, sorry.
Oh, okay. So, yes, so a question around the fact that the standards that we're developing are very important within the context of the bill, but what life they have beyond the scope of the bill. I think this is really just about the standards themselves, and yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry, I missed the end of it. Yes. So standards, British standards and PAS are enduring as long as the market requires them. In this instance, we welcome the support of MHCLG to help us deliver the programme of work, and it will last over many years. But they're not standards that are a part of the bill. They are there and will be developed in close relationship with the building safety regulator and the secondary legislation that Chandra just referred to, so that they are aligned and they serve the purpose that government seeks from the standards. But they are themselves perfectly valid and useful industry documents that will have an enduring life regardless. But in all cases, British standards are reviewed periodically based on feedback and consultation. PAS standards are reviewed even more frequently, and I'm always very open to reviewing standards or asking for them to be reviewed should there be any reason that we can do that. So these are very agile, consensus, stakeholder-led documents that will help to support the new building safety bill and the secondary legislation and deliver a combined purpose over a very long period, I hope.
Thank you. And I think we've got time for one final question. It may be a little bit difficult. I think it's perhaps for all of you, but we've had quite a few people asking about implementation and enforcement of this new approach, and questions around mandatory registration of the new roles and so on. And I guess it's really how can this new approach deliver what we want it to deliver? So who'd like to go first on that?
Well, I'll start from the standard side, as I was just talking. So the function of the standards is to provide an independent, neutral template, if you like, and Richard may want to elaborate, but they will help to support the third-party accreditation of schemes, training, professional development schemes offered up by the market to improve the competencies of individuals. So the standards will stand alone. Third-party accreditation will be an important part of this process, and the Building Competence Committee will have an oversight over that. And there will be hopefully several providers, including UCAS, in the accreditation space to help check the checkers, if you like. So that's how I see the standards part of the enforcement working.
Yeah, could I just say I entirely support that, of course. And what this specification does is it sets a common approach to the way in which people need to think about the challenge that will be offered as to whether the frameworks that they own are adequate. So you wouldn't assess an individual against this framework for competence, you'd assess the frameworks against which individuals are assessed against it. And it's all about setting the framework, it's all about setting the kind of rules for the game, if you like, so that people can move in the right direction, can understand what it is that they're being asked to achieve, and then demonstrate that to whoever needs to have confidence. So whether that's the regulator, which we certainly expect to be the case, but it might well also be the insurance industry, or it might be clients. As I said in the presentation, the way that this will be mandated is yet to be set out in absolute detail. It's a tool to be used in that respect, and I'm sure that the building safety regulator and government will provide much more information on that as time goes forward.
Yeah. So the purpose of the standards, as Richard's described, is to provide that kind of level playing field, a common framework, common understanding, common language, so that across the multiple associations, professional bodies who are offering training and professional development and qualifications in this environment, and particularly in this case, of course, related to building safety, then there is the potential to have independent scrutiny of those processes, and that the public, residents, government, and industry can be confident that across this wide range of professions and skills, there is a common basis for professional qualifications in this area of safety and quality, culture and behaviour. It's also very important, and it's this kind of apples and apples framework that is so vital to make sure there aren't any gaps across the breadth of the industry.
Okay, thank you. Unless the other panelists have anything further they'd like to add, I'll wind this up.
Very good, Claire. Thank you very much, and thank you particularly to Chandru and to Tim and Richard as our guests today. Thank you.
Yeah, and perhaps I can echo that as well. Close the webinar. So this slide can be found within the handouts. This is the handout that's been made available for you with all the relevant details on there of the website, the dedicated email address, and the way to comment on the draft. And of course, the draft itself is available on the website too. So do feel free to contact us on the dedicated email address if you do have any further urgent questions. And visit the website to find out more about the programmes. There's more details there, and we will be adding items to that site. The consultation draft and all iterations will be placed on there as well, and will be available throughout the work programme. So there'll be a record there to see how the changes develop and how the document develops. But we do really urge you to participate and look at the standards and evaluate particularly the overarching framework and the core competences in there against your own sector and subsector needs, and provide the all-important comments that we need to ensure that the document is robust and consensus based. So I think that's it. I'll say thank you again to all of our speakers. Thank you to Scott, to Chandru, to Tim, and to Richard. And thank you all very much for joining the webinar this afternoon, and for listening and for submitting all your questions. Please do take care and stay safe in these really uncertain times. And thank you very much once again. Goodbye.